Marcus Bennett believed doing the right thing was enough. One quiet night in Maple Ridge, he helped an elderly neighbor after a robbery, only to be framed by the real thief, a frightened 17-year-old who planted the stolen items in Marcus's home. In a town quick to judge, suspicion fell fast. 6 months in jail stole his business and dignity, but the truth was waiting in the smallest clue. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe some heroes are willing to look guilty to save the innocent, this story is for you. Maple Ridge was the kind of small American town that looked peaceful from a distance. Early autumn had just settled in. A thin mist clung to the streets, and the air carried the scent of damp leaves and wood smoke. The sun had dipped below the pine-covered hills, leaving behind a fading orange glow that lingered for only a few quiet seconds before the sky turned steel blue. Porch lights flickered on one by one, and the town exhaled into evening. Dylan Harper was 17 years old, tall for his age with a lean build that had not yet fully grown into adulthood. His light brown hair fell carelessly over his forehead, often hiding sharp blue eyes that shifted between defiance and uncertainty. There was a time when those eyes had carried curiosity. Now they carried restlessness. Dylan had not always been angry. His father, Thomas Harper, once worked at the local lumber mill, a broad-shouldered man with rough hands and a quiet pride in honest work. But when the mill downsized, Thomas lost his job. The confidence in his posture slowly collapsed. He spoke less. He drank more. Dylan watched the change and learned something dangerous. Effort did not always protect you. His mother, Rachel Harper, was a thin, soft-spoken woman in her early 40s with tired hazel eyes and prematurely graying hair she kept tied back in a low ponytail. She worked double shifts at a grocery store 30 minutes away. Rachel believed in kindness, believed in second chances, believed in her son. But exhaustion had begun to shape her into someone constantly rushing, out the door before sunrise, home after dark, always apologizing for being absent. Dylan filled the silence with new company. There was Kyle Mercer, 19, with a permanent smirk and a talent for making trouble sound like strategy. Kyle was broad-chested, always wearing a backward baseball cap and a leather bracelet he claimed he'd earned in a fight. He spoke confidently about easy money, about shortcuts. Dylan listened. Over months, frustration fermented into recklessness. Bills piled up at home. Arguments echoed through thin walls. Dylan told himself he wasn't desperate, just practical. On that particular evening, as the mist thickened and crickets began their steady rhythm, Dylan pulled a black hoodie over his head. He studied himself briefly in the cracked mirror above his dresser. He did not look like a criminal, he thought. Just a kid. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore lived 3 houses down from Marcus Bennett. Her home sat slightly apart from the others, a pale blue house with white shutters and a sagging porch swing. At 78, Eleanor was slender and slightly stooped, her silver hair always neatly pinned into a bun. Her face carried gentle lines carved by decades of smiling at church gatherings and town picnics. She moved slowly but deliberately, and though she lived alone since her husband passed 8 years earlier, she prided herself on independence. That night, she had been folding laundry in her living room. The television murmured softly in the background, a local weather report predicting cooler nights ahead. She never heard the back window slide open. Dylan moved quickly. His pulse thundered in his ears, louder than the floorboards beneath his sneakers. When Eleanor turned and saw a shadow standing in her kitchen doorway, she froze. He had not planned the moment beyond entry. The knife he grabbed from her own counter felt heavier than expected in his trembling hand. "Don't scream," he said, his voice lower than usual, attempting authority he did not possess. Eleanor's dark brown eyes widened, confusion turning into fear. Her hand shook as she clutched the edge of the dining chair for balance. Dylan demanded money. Cash. Anything valuable. The words came rushed, uneven. Eleanor, though terrified, remained strangely composed. Years of living alone had taught her to observe. She noticed the youth in his voice, the hesitation, the way he avoided eye contact. She handed him an envelope from a kitchen drawer, savings she kept for home repairs, and a small velvet jewelry box containing her late husband's watch and a gold bracelet. Her voice trembled. "Please, just leave." Dylan forced her toward the back door. He made her unlock it. But outside, beyond the porch light's reach, another presence existed. Marcus Bennett was 32 years old, 6 feet tall, with a solid athletic build shaped by years of manual labor. His deep brown skin glistened faintly under the yard light as he trimmed hedges behind his modest gray house. His hair was closely cropped, and his face was clean-shaven except for a faint shadow along his jaw. Marcus had steady dark eyes and a calm demeanor that people often misread as guarded. He had grown up in Maple Ridge. His mother had worked as a nurse's aide. His father had served in the Army before passing away when Marcus was 16. Responsibility matured him early. He built his landscaping business from scratch, one lawn at a time. People described him as dependable, quiet, respectful. He wore worn work gloves and moved with practiced rhythm, unaware that only 30 yards away, fear was unfolding. The back door of Eleanor's house creaked open. Dylan stepped out first, clutching the envelope and jewelry box. Eleanor remained frozen in the doorway. The yard light flickered. Marcus heard the sound, a door opening at an odd hour. He looked up. For a split second, the two young men locked eyes. Dylan's face was partially covered, but panic cannot be hidden. It radiates. Marcus instinctively straightened. "Ma'am?" he called toward Eleanor's porch. Dylan bolted. He ran across the damp grass, shoes slipping slightly as he darted toward the thin line of trees bordering the neighborhood. Leaves cracked underfoot. Branches whipped against his arms. Marcus dropped his hedge trimmer and jogged toward Eleanor's yard, concern overtaking confusion. "Mrs. Whitmore, are you all right?" His voice was firm but gentle. Eleanor stepped forward, hands trembling. "He had a knife. He took my money." Marcus felt a tightening in his chest. Anger not at her, but at the violation. "I'm calling the police," he said immediately, pulling his phone from his pocket. Eleanor nodded, tears forming but not yet falling. "Thank you, Marcus." He stood beside her while dialing, offering quiet reassurance. He described the masked figure, the direction he fled. In the distance, hidden among the trees, Dylan slowed only once he was certain no one followed. He crouched behind a fallen log, breathing hard. Through the branches, he could see Marcus standing beside Eleanor under the porch light. He saw Marcus speaking into a phone. Dylan's stomach twisted. He had thought the plan ended with escape. Instead, he had been seen. Fear crawled up his spine, thick and suffocating, and slowly, fear transformed. It became resentment. In his mind, Marcus was no longer just a witness. He was a threat. And threats, Dylan had learned from the wrong mentors, had to be handled. Back under the porch light, sirens faintly approached from town. Marcus stayed beside Eleanor, offering his jacket when she began to shiver in the cooling night air. Maple Ridge no longer felt peaceful. It felt divided by a single choice. And though the robbery was over, something far more dangerous had just begun. Dylan watched from the shadows one final time before disappearing deeper into the woods. His fear hardening into a decision that would change all of their lives. The night on Maple Ridge had only just started. Dylan Harper did not sleep that night. The image of Marcus standing beneath Eleanor Whitmore's porch light replayed in his mind over and over again. The steady way Marcus had held the phone, the direction he had pointed toward the woods, the certainty in his posture. Dylan lay in his narrow bed staring at the cracked ceiling, listening to the hum of the old refrigerator down the hall and his father's uneven snoring drifting from the living room couch. Every small sound felt amplified. Every thought felt sharp. If Marcus described him clearly enough, someone might recognize his height, his build, the way he ran. Maple Ridge was small. People noticed patterns. Fear sharpened into strategy. Just after midnight, when the neighborhood lights had dimmed and most houses had settled into silence, Dylan pulled the hoodie back on. The envelope of cash and the velvet jewelry box lay hidden in his backpack. His hands trembled as he stepped outside, but his face was set with a determination that did not belong to someone his age. Marcus's home was modest, a single-story gray house with a detached garage. The driveway gravel crunched faintly beneath Dylan's sneakers as he moved carefully along the side fence. A motion sensor light flickered on for a moment, and he froze against the wall, heart pounding. After several seconds, it shut off again. The garage door was not fully latched. Marcus often left it slightly open for ventilation after long days of yard work. Dylan slipped inside. The smell of cut grass and motor oil filled the dim space. Tools hung neatly on pegboards. Lawn equipment was arranged with practical precision. Everything in the garage reflected Marcus's character. Orderly, hard-working, disciplined. That order felt almost accusatory. Dylan opened a tall metal storage cabinet near the back wall. He placed the velvet jewelry box on a shelf behind an old fertilizer bag. He tucked the envelope beneath a folded tarp. He hesitated only once. His reflection stared back faintly from the metal surface of the cabinet. Pale face, wide eyes. Then he shut the door and slipped back into the night. By morning, Maple Ridge was buzzing. Police cruisers had parked near Eleanor Whitmore's home. Neighbors gathered in small clusters along the sidewalk. Some stood with arms crossed. Others held coffee cups as though this were an unusual but temporary interruption to routine. Marcus Bennett stood beside Officer Grant Collins on the porch. Officer Grant Collins was 38 years old, tall and broad-shouldered with closely shaved sandy hair and a square jaw. He wore his uniform neatly pressed, his badge polished. Collins had transferred to Maple Ridge 2 years earlier from a busier suburban district. He believed in efficiency, in clear answers, in closing cases quickly. His dark eyes were observant but impatient, and there was a faint scar along his chin from a training accident early in his career. A reminder, he often said, that hesitation cost outcomes. He took notes as Marcus spoke. Marcus's voice was calm but firm. He came out the back door, masked, medium height, slim build, ran toward the woods. Collins nodded, occasionally glancing toward the trees. Eleanor Whitmore stood just inside her doorway, wrapped in a knitted beige cardigan. Her silver hair seemed slightly looser than usual, and the softness in her expression had been replaced by visible unease. She answered questions carefully, choosing words with caution. As the officers moved about the property, more neighbors gathered. Among them was Sarah Mitchell, a 45-year-old real estate agent known for her polished appearance and carefully measured politeness. She was tall and slender, with straight blonde hair that framed her sharp features. Sarah had moved to Maple Ridge 15 years earlier after a difficult divorce. That experience had hardened her trust. She believed strongly in self-protection and caution. She whispered often about keeping the neighborhood safe. Dylan stood near the edge of the gathering, hands shoved deep into his hoodie pockets. He kept his expression neutral. As conversations broke into smaller pockets, he leaned slightly toward Sarah and another neighbor, Mr. Leonard Price, a retired mechanic in his early 60s with a stocky build, thick gray mustache, and a tendency to nod slowly before speaking. Leonard valued routine and stability. Sudden change unsettled him. "You know," Dylan said quietly, keeping his tone thoughtful rather than accusatory, "Marcus is always outside working late, watching everything." Sarah tilted her head slightly. "What do you mean?" "Just saying. He's the closest house, and he noticed right away." Leonard rubbed his chin. "Closest, huh? Dylan shrugged as if reluctant. Maybe he saw more than he's saying. The words were subtle. They did not accuse directly. They suggested. And suggestion travels easily in small towns. By late morning, Officer Collins approached Marcus again. "We'd like to search your property, Mr. Bennett. Standard procedure. You were the closest witness." Marcus did not hesitate. "Of course, I want whoever did this caught." There was no anger in his voice, only confidence that transparency would protect him. Tanya Bennett arrived shortly after. Marcus's younger sister, 27, with warm brown skin and shoulder-length natural curls pulled into a loose bun. She worked as a medical assistant in a clinic 2 towns over. Tanya had inherited her father's expressive eyes and her mother's quiet resilience. She walked quickly up the driveway, concern written across her face. "What's going on?" she asked Marcus. "Just a search," he replied calmly. "Routine." Tanya folded her arms, watching carefully as officers moved toward the garage. Inside, Officer Collins opened drawers, lifted toolboxes, examined shelves. The tall metal storage cabinet stood against the back wall. Collins opened it. For a moment, there was silence. Then he reached behind the fertilizer bag. The velvet jewelry box appeared in his hand. The air changed. Tanya inhaled sharply. Marcus stared, confusion overtaking composure. "That's not mine," Marcus said immediately. Collins's expression hardened. He pulled the envelope from beneath the tarp. "This was reported stolen." Marcus stepped forward instinctively, then stopped himself. "If I took it," he said slowly, "why would I call you? Why would I bring you here?" Collins did not answer directly. He signaled another officer to document the evidence. Outside, whispers rose like wind through dry leaves. Sarah Mitchell placed her hand lightly over her mouth. Leonard Price shook his head slowly. Eleanor Whitmore, standing near her doorway, looked stunned. Her eyes moved from the jewelry box to Marcus, searching for something: recognition, denial, proof. Marcus felt the weight of 100 invisible judgments pressing down. Tanya stepped closer to him. "This isn't right," she said quietly, though her voice trembled. Collins turned to Marcus. "We'll need you to come with us for questioning." Marcus nodded once. "I have nothing to hide." Across the street, Dylan felt a strange mixture of relief and nausea. He had expected fear to disappear once suspicion shifted. Instead, it lingered, heavier. He watched as Marcus was escorted toward the patrol car, not in handcuffs yet, but surrounded by authority. The narrative had already begun shaping itself in people's minds. Closest neighbor, present at the scene, evidence in his garage. Fear had successfully planted doubt, and doubt was growing roots. As the patrol car door closed, Maple Ridge felt different from the night before. Not louder, not chaotic, just divided. Dylan exhaled slowly, telling himself this was survival. Yet beneath that justification, something uneasy stirred. But he pushed it down, because for now, suspicion had found its target. And that was enough. The trial moved faster than many expected. Maple Ridge had seen its share of disputes: property lines, traffic accidents, minor theft, but rarely something that divided neighbors along invisible lines of trust and doubt. The courtroom felt smaller during the final hearing, as though the wooden walls themselves were leaning inward to listen. Marcus Bennett stood at the defense table beside Daniel Reeves. He wore a dark, neatly pressed shirt and slacks Tanya had insisted on buying him for court. His posture remained upright, but the quiet steadiness that once radiated confidence now carried strain. He had slept little the night before, not because he feared prison, but because he feared losing his name. Judge Harold Whitaker's voice echoed across the chamber when he delivered the ruling. The evidence found in Marcus's garage, he said, could not be ignored. There was no concrete proof of another perpetrator. Suspicion alone was insufficient, but possession of stolen property weighed heavily. 6 months in county detention, the judge concluded. The words did not shout. They did not thunder. They settled like dust. Permanent. Eleanor Whitmore sat stiffly in the front row. Her hands trembled in her lap, fingers gripping the edge of her cardigan. Her testimony had not been accusatory, yet it had leaned toward uncertainty. She had admitted she did not know Marcus well. She had admitted she sometimes felt uneasy living alone. In the sterile clarity of a courtroom, nuance disappears. Marcus turned briefly toward her before the bailiff approached. His expression was not anger. It was disbelief restrained by dignity. Outside the courthouse, the sky hung low and gray. Wind moved through the maple trees lining the square, scattering dry leaves across the pavement. Tanya Bennett stood near the steps, her shoulders tight with frustration. She had argued with Daniel Reeves until midnight about strategy, about appeal options, about next steps. But appeals required time, and time was something her brother would now lose. A small crowd lingered near the entrance. Sarah Mitchell spoke quietly to Leonard Price again. "The judge wouldn't do it without reason," she said. Her voice was softer than before, but certainty remained. She had built her life on caution. After her divorce years ago, she had trusted someone who betrayed her financially. That lesson had shaped her worldview. Doubt first, trust later. Pastor Elijah Green stood at a distance, hands folded, watching Marcus being led toward the transport vehicle. His calm face showed quiet sorrow. He believed in systems, but he also knew systems could falter. Across the square, Emily Carter observed everything carefully. Emily was 26, tall and slim, with auburn hair tied loosely at the back of her neck. Her hazel eyes were sharp and attentive, constantly scanning for inconsistencies. She wore a navy blazer slightly too large for her narrow shoulders, a habit from covering council meetings and court hearings where she preferred to appear older than her age. Emily had grown up in a neighboring town, the daughter of a public defender who once lost a case that haunted him for years. That memory had shaped her interest in justice reporting. She did not chase scandal, she chased truth. As Marcus was placed into the vehicle, Emily noticed something subtle. He did not look defeated. He looked confused. That distinction stayed with her. Dylan Harper watched from the far end of the square, half hidden behind the trunk of an old oak tree. His hoodie hood was pulled low, though the weather did not require it. His blue eyes followed Marcus until the vehicle turned the corner. 6 months. The number echoed louder than expected. He had imagined suspicion, questioning, perhaps a fine. He had not imagined prison. Rachel Harper stood behind him, unaware of the storm inside her son. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Justice works in the end," she said quietly, believing it. Dylan nodded, but something inside him had shifted. At the county detention facility 30 miles away, Marcus adjusted to confinement with restrained composure. The facility was not violent, but it was loud. Metal doors clanging, distant voices echoing down concrete corridors. He was assigned a shared cell with Harold Hank Turner, a 50-year-old former truck driver with a thick beard and tired green eyes. Hank had been sentenced for tax fraud. He carried himself with a quiet regret, spending most of his time reading old paperback novels and speaking little. "You don't look like you belong here," Hank remarked on the first evening. Marcus gave a faint smile. "I don't." Hank nodded slowly. "Most say that." Marcus did not argue. He knew words alone meant little inside these walls. Back in Maple Ridge, Marcus's landscaping business began to falter. His small client list, built over years of steady reliability, started to thin. Some customers canceled appointments politely. Others simply stopped returning calls. Tanya tried to keep operations running on weekends. She hired a part-time helper, Miguel Alvarez, a 19-year-old college student with a slim build and earnest brown eyes. Miguel had grown up helping his father in construction and believed in hard work without complaint. He respected Marcus deeply and felt anger at the situation, though he expressed it quietly through longer hours. Still, without Marcus, contracts slipped away. At Eleanor Whitmore's house, silence felt heavier than before. Winston, the gray cat, prowled more restlessly at night, as if sensing unease. Eleanor replayed Marcus's final glance in her mind. She told herself the court had decided. Yet doubt crept in during quiet hours. Emily Carter began reviewing court transcripts. She interviewed Daniel Reeves in his small downtown office, where law books lined shelves from floor to ceiling. "Something doesn't fit," she told him. Daniel adjusted his glasses thoughtfully. "The timeline?" "The psychology," Emily replied. "Why would someone call the police on themselves?" Daniel did not answer immediately. "Juries trust physical evidence," he said at last, "even when context is missing." Emily left the office unsettled. She walked past Marcus's house that evening. The yard looked overgrown. The once trimmed hedges sagged unevenly. The absence of care felt symbolic. Across town, Dylan avoided eye contact with neighbors. Kyle Mercer had noticed the tension in his friend. "You're quiet," Kyle remarked one afternoon, leaning against the hood of his car. "Just tired," Dylan answered. Kyle smirked. "See? Easy money." Dylan did not respond. 6 months stretched ahead like an open highway, long, unavoidable. The day Marcus was officially processed into long-term custody, Tanya stood outside the facility gate, arms wrapped tightly around herself. She watched until the doors closed behind him. Emily returned home that night and began drafting notes. She did not write accusations, she wrote questions. In Maple Ridge, conversations continued, but more quietly now. The town was divided. Not loudly, not violently, but subtly. Some believed order had been restored. Others felt an unease they could not name. Marcus adjusted to routine inside the facility. Morning counts, meal lines, limited recreation. He spent hours thinking about that night, the masked figure, the direction he ran, the certainty in his memory. He knew what he saw. But knowledge without proof carried no weight. The chapter closes as Marcus begins serving his 6-month sentence, his business weakening in his absence. The town split in belief, and Emily Carter quietly doubting the verdict while Dylan carries a growing burden of guilt. 6 months passed not with violence but with weight. County detention settled into Marcus Bennett's bones like cold that refused to leave. The days were predictable. Early counts, institutional meals, assigned chores, but monotony can press harder than chaos. Marcus moved through routine quietly, his tall frame slightly leaner now, his once broad shoulders subtly tightened by confinement. He read when he could. He exercised in the yard during limited recreation hours. He kept his head down, not out of fear, but discipline. His cellmate, Hank Turner, remained consistent, gruff but not unkind. Hank had grown fond of Marcus in the quiet way men sometimes do, through shared silence rather than words. "You're thinking too much," Hank once muttered while flipping through a paperback Western novel. Marcus gave a faint half-smile. He was thinking constantly about Eleanor's porch light, about the masked figure running, about the cabinet in his garage. Time inside did not dull memory. It sharpened it. Meanwhile, Maple Ridge continued forward, though not unchanged. Tanya Bennett fought to keep her brother's landscaping business alive. She had taken a second small loan under her own name, her normally steady handwriting trembling when she signed the papers. She worked weekdays at the clinic and weekends trimming lawns, Miguel Alvarez beside her with quiet loyalty. Miguel's slight frame had grown stronger over the months. His respect for Marcus translated into effort, though customers were fewer now. Some neighbors still avoided eye contact. Others spoke politely but distantly. Emily Carter's investigation deepened. Her small apartment above the hardware store became a web of notes pinned across a corkboard. Timelines, witness statements, maps of yard distances. She compared Officer Collins's report to Eleanor's testimony and Marcus's original statement. The more she read, the more the simplicity of the case unsettled her. One inconsistency stood out. The intruder had exited through Eleanor's back door. Marcus had been trimming hedges at the rear of his property. Yet the cabinet where the stolen items were found was located deep inside Marcus's garage, behind equipment and storage. Emily circled one word repeatedly: access. One afternoon, she visited Mrs. Whitmore again. Eleanor answered the door slowly, Winston weaving between her ankles. "Do you still believe Marcus did this?" Emily asked gently. Eleanor hesitated longer this time, her silver brows knit together. "I don't know what I believe anymore," she admitted. That uncertainty planted something new, not accusation, not exoneration, but doubt. 6 months eventually ended as quietly as they began. On a pale spring morning, Marcus stepped out of the county facility carrying a small plastic bag containing his personal belongings. The air felt larger outside, though he inhaled it cautiously as if unsure whether freedom would remain steady. Tanya waited in her old sedan, eyes shining with relief she refused to show fully. When Marcus approached, she stepped out and embraced him tightly. "You're home," she whispered. He nodded. The drive back to Maple Ridge was silent at first. Marcus watched familiar roads slide past. Gas stations, fields, a faded billboard advertising farm equipment. Nothing looked different, yet everything felt altered. When they reached his house, Marcus paused before stepping inside. The yard was uneven. The hedges had grown wild. The paint along the garage trim had begun peeling. Inside, dust had settled in thin layers across surfaces. Marcus did not complain. He walked slowly through each room, touching door frames, countertops, light switches. He lingered longest in the garage. The tall metal cabinet stood exactly where it had been. He opened it carefully. Empty. He closed it and stood still. Tanya began unpacking small groceries in the kitchen while Marcus moved methodically around the house. He was not searching for proof anymore, at least not consciously. He was reacquainting himself with space. Behind the cabinet, near the concrete floor, something caught his eye, a faint discoloration. He crouched. The mark was small, barely noticeable, a darkened stain absorbed into the porous surface. Marcus leaned closer. It resembled dried blood. His jaw tightened. He traced the edge of the stain lightly with his finger, then stood and moved toward the cabinet hinge. There, caught between the metal seam and wood frame, was a strand of hair. Long. Brown. Too long to belong to him. Marcus froze. Tanya noticed his stillness. "What is it?" He stepped aside so she could see. The hair shimmered faintly in the afternoon light. "It wasn't here before," he said quietly. Tanya knelt beside him. "Are you sure?" "I cleaned this garage myself for years. I know what belongs here." The memory struck him clearly. The intruder had fled quickly that night. If someone had returned, if someone had planted evidence, the timing might not have ended with the first visit. His heartbeat quickened, not with fear, but clarity. He stood and wiped his hands on his jeans. "We're calling the police." Tanya's eyes widened slightly. "After everything?" "Yes?" There was no bitterness in his tone, only resolve. Officer Grant Collins answered the call personally. His voice over the phone carried controlled surprise. "You found something new?" "Yes," Marcus replied evenly. "A stain, and a strand of hair." There was a pause. "We'll send someone," Collins said. Within an hour, a patrol car arrived. This time, Collins entered the garage more cautiously. He crouched beside the stain, examining it under better lighting. A forensic technician accompanied him. Laura Kim, a petite woman in her early 30s with sharp black hair, cut just below her chin and observant dark eyes. Laura had transferred from a larger city lab and was known for methodical precision. She rarely spoke unless certain. She collected the hair carefully with tweezers and swabbed the stain. "Could be blood," she said simply. Collins remained quiet longer than usual. The tone had shifted. Evidence had once pointed cleanly in one direction. Now it pointed somewhere else. Across town, Dylan Harper lay awake again that night, though he had not yet heard about the discovery. Sleep had never returned fully during Marcus's absence. His reflection in mirrors looked thinner, paler. Kyle had stopped talking about the incident weeks earlier, assuming it was over. But for Dylan, it had never ended. Back in the garage, Marcus stood with arms folded, watching as Laura sealed the evidence bags. He felt no triumph, only steadiness. For the first time in months, something tangible existed beyond his word. As the patrol car pulled away, Tanya exhaled slowly. "Maybe this changes everything," she said. Marcus looked toward the fading sunlight at the edge of the yard. "Maybe," he replied. The chapter closes with Marcus discovering the dried bloodstain and long strand of hair in his garage, contacting police and new evidence being collected, remaining strictly within the events summarized. The evidence did not speak loudly, but it spoke clearly. 3 days after Laura Kim collected the dried stain and the strand of hair from Marcus Bennett's garage, the county forensic lab confirmed what suspicion had once refused to consider. The stain tested positive for human blood. The hair contained a viable root. DNA was extracted, cross-referenced with local records, and submitted through the state database. The match came back quietly on a gray Tuesday afternoon. Dylan Harper. Officer Grant Collins stared at the lab report longer than necessary. His usually steady jaw tightened as he reread the line confirming the probability ratio. Near certain. Statistically undeniable. Laura Kim stood across from his desk, arms folded loosely. Her expression remained professional but firm. "The profile aligns perfectly," she said. "There's no contamination. Chain of custody is clean." Collins nodded once. He had built his career on decisive action. Now decisiveness felt heavier. Outside the station, Maple Ridge carried on unaware. Children rode bicycles along cracked sidewalks. Mrs. Whitmore watered her small rose garden with trembling but determined hands. Winston, the gray cat, lounged beneath the porch railing, his pale green eyes half closed against the sun. Dylan sat in his bedroom at the Harper house, unaware that his name had just surfaced inside an evidence file. His once careless posture had grown rigid over the past months. Dark circles had settled beneath his blue eyes. He avoided mirrors now, avoided conversations. Even Kyle Mercer had begun drifting away, sensing something unsettled in his friend. Rachel Harper noticed the change most. She stood in the kitchen that afternoon, thin frame leaning slightly against the counter as she watched her son stare blankly at the television. "You haven't been yourself," she said gently. Her voice carried fatigue, but also maternal intuition, sharpened by years of working late shifts and reading emotional undercurrents in customers and co-workers alike. "I'm fine," Dylan replied too quickly. Rachel studied him carefully. She had raised him mostly alone in spirit, even when Thomas was physically present. She recognized guilt the way others recognized hunger. At the police station, Collins requested a warrant for Dylan's arrest. The paperwork felt procedural, but nothing about the moment felt routine. When the patrol car pulled up outside the Harper residence that evening, Rachel stepped onto the porch first. She froze when she saw Officer Collins approach. Dylan followed. He did not run. His shoulders slumped slightly as though some part of him had expected this knock for months. Collins's voice was steady but quieter than usual. "Dylan Harper, we need you to come with us." Rachel's face drained of color. "For what?" Collins held the folder close to his side. "New evidence has surfaced." Dylan looked briefly at his mother, then at the ground. He knew. Inside the interrogation room, hours later, Dylan sat across from Collins and Laura Kim. The room felt smaller than Marcus had once described. Fluorescent light hummed faintly overhead. Dylan's fingers trembled against the metal tabletop. Collins placed the lab report in front of him. "We found your blood in Marcus Bennett's garage," he said plainly. "And your hair." Silence stretched. Dylan's breathing grew uneven. I cut myself that night," he whispered finally. "On the cabinet." Laura's expression did not change. Collins leaned forward slightly. "Why were you in that garage, Dylan?" Tears formed quickly, surprising even him. He had rehearsed denial for months, but denial collapses under evidence. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," he said, voice cracking. "I just didn't want him describing me. I thought if they found the stuff in his place, they'd stop looking." The confession came haltingly at first, then faster, as though words had been dammed behind fear. He admitted breaking into Eleanor Whitmore's home. He admitted planting the stolen items in Marcus's cabinet. He admitted whispering doubts among neighbors. "I didn't think they'd give him jail," Dylan said, hands covering his face. "I just wanted to protect myself." Rachel sat outside the interrogation room, hands clasped tightly in her lap. When Collins informed her of the confession, her knees nearly gave way. She had always believed mistakes could be corrected quietly. This mistake had grown too large. Back at her small apartment, Emily Carter received a call from Daniel Reeves. "They've identified the real perpetrator," Daniel said. Emily stood abruptly from her desk. "Who?" There was a pause. "Dylan Harper?" Emily exhaled slowly. She thought of Marcus standing beneath the courthouse columns. She thought of Eleanor's trembling testimony. She thought of suspicion spreading like smoke. The next morning, the news rippled through Maple Ridge faster than the autumn wind months earlier. Sarah Mitchell read the headline online first. Her posture stiffened as she scrolled through details. She did not speak immediately, but something in her expression shifted. Less certainty, more discomfort. Leonard Price shook his head slowly while standing outside the bakery. "Didn't see that coming," he muttered. Pastor Elijah Green closed his eyes briefly when he heard the news, whispering a quiet prayer, not of triumph, but of reflection. Eleanor Whitmore sat heavily in her armchair. Winston curled against her side. Tears slipped silently down her cheeks. "I was wrong," she murmured into the quiet room. At the police station, Dylan signed a formal confession statement. His youthful arrogance had vanished entirely. In its place stood a frightened 17-year-old who now understood the weight of consequence. Collins remained composed, but his eyes carried something new. Regret. He contacted the district attorney immediately. Marcus Bennett was called to the courthouse for an emergency hearing. When he entered the building again, the air felt different. The same wooden benches, the same creaking floors. But this time, whispers carried apology instead of accusation. Judge Harold Whitaker presided once more. His silver hair seemed slightly more disordered than usual, his blue-gray eyes less impenetrable. The confession was read aloud. Dylan, seated beside a public defender, kept his gaze lowered. Marcus listened without interruption. When Judge Whitaker formally vacated the previous conviction, his voice was measured but heavy. "This court acknowledges a grave miscarriage of justice." The words echoed against the wooden walls. Eleanor Whitmore stood shakily and approached Marcus afterward. Her cardigan sleeves trembled as she reached for his hands. "I am so sorry," she said through tears. Marcus looked at her steadily. There was pain in his eyes, but not bitterness. "I never stopped telling the truth," he replied quietly. Outside, reporters gathered. Emily Carter stood near the steps, notebook in hand. She did not shout questions. She waited. Marcus exited the courthouse into daylight once more, this time without shackles of doubt. The truth had surfaced not through noise, but through patience. The chapter closes with the DNA match confirming Dylan Harper as the perpetrator, his confession following, and Marcus Bennett's innocence formally restored, remaining strictly within the summarized events. The public hearing was scheduled for Friday morning, and Maple Ridge had not felt this tense in years. The courthouse lawn filled earlier than usual. People who had once whispered now stood openly in clusters, waiting not for scandal, but for resolution. The sky was clear, sunlight falling cleanly across the white columns as if the town itself demanded clarity. Marcus Bennett arrived with Tanya at his side. He wore a charcoal suit Daniel Reeves had insisted upon. Simple, tailored, dignified. His posture was straight, shoulders steady, though the faint lines near his eyes told the story of months lost. He walked without hesitation, not as a man seeking revenge, but as a man reclaiming ground. Inside the courtroom, Judge Harold Whitaker took his seat slowly. The usual authority in his presence felt tempered by something heavier: reflection. His silver hair was combed back carefully, but his eyes revealed fatigue. He had reviewed the original proceedings repeatedly over the past week. A judge's role demanded finality, but today demanded humility. Rachel Harper sat near the back row, hands folded tightly in her lap. Her thin frame seemed smaller than before. Her once neatly tied ponytail hung loosely, strands of gray more visible now. She had not slept much since Dylan's confession. The shame she carried was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet and suffocating. She did not defend her son. She did not excuse him. She simply endured. Dylan Harper sat beside his appointed attorney. The 17-year-old who once stood tall in defiance now appeared younger, almost fragile. His shoulders sloped inward, and his pale face bore the weight of consequence. He did not lift his eyes when Marcus entered. Eleanor Whitmore was assisted to the front row by Pastor Elijah Green. She wore a pale blue cardigan, hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her glasses. Winston the cat remained at home, unaware of the gravity unfolding. Eleanor's dignity remained intact, but her certainty had long since dissolved. Officer Grant Collins stood near the prosecution table. His uniform was pressed as always, but today he did not stand rigidly. His posture was straighter than pride, yet softer than authority. The scar along his chin seemed more pronounced under the courtroom lights. He had replayed the investigation in his mind repeatedly, recognizing the haste he once justified as efficiency. The hearing began without spectacle. Judge Whitaker's voice carried clearly. This court acknowledges that new evidence and a sworn confession have overturned the previous conviction of Marcus Bennett. The words were formal, but their meaning was personal. He detailed the forensic findings: the DNA match, the confirmed chain of custody, the confession of Dylan Harper admitting to burglary and deliberate framing. As the record was read, a stillness filled the room. Judge Whitaker continued, "This court formally vacates the prior sentence and restores the full legal standing of Mr. Bennett." There was no applause, only release. Eleanor Whitmore rose slowly from her seat. Pastor Green steadied her elbow as she approached Marcus. Her eyes brimmed with tears that did not fall immediately, as if she wished to maintain composure until the final second. "I misjudged you," she said softly, "and I allowed fear to guide my words." Marcus looked at her without resentment. "Fear does that to people," he replied gently. "It doesn't make them enemies." Her tears fell then, quiet but sincere. Officer Collins stepped forward next. His voice, usually controlled, carried a different tone. "Mr. Bennett, I moved too quickly. I allowed the appearance of evidence to outweigh thorough examination. That was my failure." Marcus held his gaze. "We all want safety," he said, "but safety without fairness is fragile." Rachel Harper stood when the judge allowed a brief statement from Dylan. Dylan's voice trembled. "I was scared," he said, barely audible. "I didn't think about what it would do to him. I didn't think about anything. Marcus did not interrupt. He did not respond. The judge concluded by ordering the official clearing of Marcus's criminal record and scheduling administrative procedures to ensure public documentation of the wrongful conviction. He also noted that compensation would be made available through county review. But the hearing was not only legal, it was communal. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered, microphones raised but respectful. Emily Carter stood among them, notebook in hand. Her auburn hair caught the sunlight as she observed every detail, not hunting for drama, but for truth fully spoken. When Marcus stepped onto the courthouse steps, cameras clicked softly. Daniel Reeves leaned toward him. "You don't have to speak," he offered. Marcus paused. Then he stepped forward. The wind moved gently across the lawn, rustling maple leaves that had begun turning again with the approaching season. "I lost 6 months," Marcus said evenly. His voice carried calm authority, not anger. 6 months of work, 6 months of trust, 6 months of being seen as something I am not. He let the words settle. "But I gained something too," he continued. "I learned how quickly we can believe what fits our fear. I learned how silence can be mistaken for guilt. And I learned that dignity is something no one can take unless we give it away." He glanced briefly toward the crowd, toward Sarah Mitchell, who stood among neighbors, her expression thoughtful rather than defensive. "We cannot choose the color of our skin," Marcus said, "but we can choose how we treat each other. Fairness isn't automatic. It requires patience, it requires listening, it requires courage." The lawn remained quiet. "I don't want revenge," he added. "I want understanding. I want this town to be better tomorrow than it was yesterday." Behind him, Eleanor Whitmore nodded faintly. Pastor Green bowed his head in affirmation. Even Officer Collins stood still, absorbing each word. Emily Carter lowered her pen momentarily, recognizing that some statements needed no embellishment. Sarah Mitchell stepped forward hesitantly once the crowd began dispersing. Her tall, slender frame seemed less rigid than before. "I judged too quickly," she admitted quietly to Marcus. "I thought I was protecting the neighborhood." Marcus offered a small nod. "Protection and prejudice sometimes look alike from far away," he replied. "It's up close that we see the difference." Rachel Harper approached last. She did not speak immediately. She simply looked at Marcus with eyes full of apology that words could not measure. "I will make sure he understands what he did," she said softly. Marcus nodded once. "That's your responsibility, not mine." There was no hostility, only boundary. As the crowd thinned, Emily approached Daniel Reeves. "This isn't just a correction," she said. "It's a reckoning." Daniel adjusted his glasses thoughtfully. "Justice isn't loud," he replied. "But when it's wrong, it echoes." The courthouse doors closed slowly behind the last official. Maple Ridge did not transform instantly. Prejudices do not evaporate overnight. But something had shifted. People spoke differently that afternoon. Softer, more reflective. Marcus stood at the base of the courthouse steps a moment longer, sunlight warm against his face. He had walked those steps once in shame. Now he walked them in restored honor. The chapter closes with Dylan's confession publicly acknowledged, apologies offered by Eleanor and Officer Collins, Rachel Harper's silent grief, and Judge Whitaker ordering the formal public hearing that restores Marcus's name, remaining strictly within the summarized events. The courtroom had never been that full. Every wooden bench was occupied. The air felt warm despite the early autumn chill outside, bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder in quiet anticipation. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting pale beams across the polished floor. Dust motes floated in the light like suspended breath. Judge Harold Whitaker adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. His voice carried a steadiness that felt different from previous hearings. Not defensive, not rigid, but reflective. He formally declared the conviction of Marcus Bennett null and void. The words were precise, deliberate, entered into the record without ambiguity. Then came the unexpected addition. "The county," he said, "offers financial compensation for the time Mr. Bennett was wrongfully incarcerated." A murmur moved softly through the room. Marcus stood. He did not rush to the podium. He walked forward calmly. His charcoal suit fitted neatly against his tall frame. The months in detention had refined his posture rather than diminished it. His deep brown eyes scanned the room once, not seeking validation, but acknowledgement. Tanya Bennett sat behind him, her hands clasped tightly together. Her curls were pulled back neatly, and though fatigue lingered in her features from months of balancing work and family, pride now stood taller than exhaustion. Marcus faced the judge first. "Your Honor," he began evenly, his voice clear but not raised, "money cannot return 6 months of my life." The courtroom grew completely still. "It cannot rebuild the nights my sister worried. It cannot restore the clients I lost. And it cannot erase the doubt that followed me through this town." He paused. "But what matters," he continued, "is that the truth is spoken publicly, that the record is corrected, that my name is not left with a shadow." Judge Whitaker nodded slowly, understanding the weight of those words. Marcus turned slightly, addressing the room. "None of us chooses the color of our skin," he said, "but we can choose how we treat each other. Fairness is not automatic. It requires patience. It requires listening. It requires courage." The silence that followed was not empty. It was reflective. In the second row, Sarah Mitchell lowered her gaze briefly. She had spent the past week re-evaluating her own words, replaying the confidence with which she once spoke about safety and suspicion. She stood tall, as always, her blonde hair straight against her shoulders, but something in her posture had softened. Years ago, betrayal had shaped her worldview. Today, she recognized that fear had shaped it too much. Pastor Elijah Green bowed his head slightly in quiet agreement. Judge Whitaker formally recorded Marcus's refusal of compensation, but insisted that documentation of the wrongful conviction would be publicly accessible and permanently amended. When the gavel struck, it did not echo sharply. It landed gently. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. Cameras were raised, but no one shouted. Emily Carter stepped forward first. Her auburn hair caught in the breeze, her hazel eyes sharp but warm. She had prepared notes, but she lowered them when Marcus approached. "Do you regret refusing the compensation?" she asked calmly. Marcus shook his head. "I don't want charity, I want accountability." Emily nodded once. That evening, her article went live online. It was not sensational. It did not dramatize. It documented. She detailed the timeline, the investigation flaws, the DNA findings, the confession. She included Marcus's statement in full, without trimming context. She ended the article with a question rather than a conclusion. What does fairness require from us? By morning, the story had spread beyond Maple Ridge. Regional news outlets picked it up. Comments flooded in, some supportive, some defensive, many reflective. Back in town, something subtle shifted. Miguel Alvarez was the first to show up at Marcus's house at sunrise the following Monday. The 19-year-old arrived with a truckload of equipment and an earnest grin. "We've got work," he said simply. Word traveled quickly. By noon, 2 former clients called Tanya asking to reschedule lawn services. By afternoon, 3 new homeowners requested estimates. Then Eleanor Whitmore arrived. She walked slowly up the driveway, Winston absent this time but dignity intact. She carried a small folded note in her hand. "I would like you to take care of my yard again," she said softly, "if you're willing." Marcus looked at her carefully. "I am," he replied. They did not discuss the past in detail. They acknowledged it by choosing forward movement. Sarah Mitchell stopped by later that week as well. She stood at the edge of the lawn, hands clasped before her, and requested a consultation for her property. "I prefer to work with someone reliable," she said, meeting Marcus's eyes directly this time. He nodded once. "I'll be there Thursday." Across town, Dylan Harper faced sentencing. Because of his age and confession, the court issued a reduced sentence paired with mandatory counseling and community service. He did not avoid consequence, but he avoided long-term incarceration. Rachel Harper attended every session. She had cut back her work hours to be present. The fatigue in her features had not disappeared, but determination had replaced helplessness. She spoke little in public, but privately she had begun rebuilding her relationship with her son, not through denial, but through accountability. Dylan entered counseling sessions with Dr. Martin Hayes, a middle-aged therapist with kind brown eyes and a steady voice. Dr. Hayes wore simple sweaters and listened more than he spoke. He believed fear, when unexamined, mutates into harm. His office contained no harsh lighting, only soft lamps and framed landscape photographs. Dylan did not speak easily at first, but he stayed. Back in Maple Ridge, the community held a small town meeting 2 weeks later. It was not mandated, it was voluntary. Chairs filled the community center hall. People who had once whispered now spoke openly about assumptions, about haste, about responsibility. Officer Collins addressed the room briefly. His posture was firm but humble. "Procedure must not replace thoroughness," he admitted. It was not a speech crafted for reputation. It was acknowledgement. Pastor Green facilitated discussion gently, ensuring no voice drowned out another. Marcus did not dominate the meeting. He listened. He spoke when necessary, not to accuse but to remind. "We all share this town," he said. "That means we share the responsibility to protect each other without prejudice." The meeting ended without applause, without dramatic declarations. But neighbors lingered to speak face to face. That mattered. Weeks passed. Marcus's landscaping business slowly regained stability. The yard behind his house returned to careful symmetry. The once wild hedges stood trimmed again, deliberate and steady. On a quiet Saturday afternoon, as he worked beneath a clear sky, Tanya stepped onto the porch and watched him for a moment. "You okay?" she asked. Marcus leaned on his rake, glancing toward the street where children rode bicycles again. "I'm better," he replied. The town had not become perfect. Not everyone admitted fault openly. Not every conversation healed instantly. But the silence that once carried suspicion now carried thoughtfulness. Emily Carter's article was nominated for a regional journalism award weeks later, though she brushed aside congratulations. "The story wasn't about me," she told Daniel Reeves during a brief coffee meeting. "It was about listening longer than we usually do." As autumn returned fully to Maple Ridge, leaves fell across sidewalks once more. Marcus walked through town one evening without lowered eyes, without tightened shoulders. He walked as he always had, steady, upright. But now the town watched differently, not with doubt, with recognition. The chapter closes with Marcus publicly refusing compensation, delivering a statement about fairness and dignity, Emily publishing the full story to spark wider discussion, the community responding with renewed support, Dylan receiving a reduced sentence with counseling, Rachel committing to change, and Maple Ridge moving forward, imperfect but more honest. This story is not only about a crime or a courtroom. It is about how quickly fear can turn into judgment. In everyday life, we do not sit on a judge's bench, but we make decisions about people every single day. We decide who looks suspicious, who looks trustworthy, who deserves patience. And too often we decide before we truly understand. Marcus lost 6 months not because there was clear truth against him, but because doubt moved faster than fairness. That is a lesson for all of us. Assumptions may feel safe, but they can quietly destroy someone's dignity. In our workplaces, schools, neighborhoods, and even online conversations, we must learn to pause, to listen, to verify before we accuse, to protect justice even when it is inconvenient. Dylan's story teaches another lesson. Fear does not excuse wrongdoing. One selfish decision can harm innocent people and ripple through an entire community. But accountability matters. Admitting wrong is painful, yet it is the first step toward growth. In our daily lives, when we make mistakes, we must choose honesty over pride. This story also reminds us that money cannot replace honor. Reputation, trust, and character are built slowly and can be damaged quickly. The way we treat others reflects who we truly are. We cannot choose our skin color, our background, or where we are born. But we can choose fairness. We can choose empathy. We can choose courage. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs a reminder to slow down before judging. Leave a comment and tell us what lesson stood out to you. Where are you watching from today? Your voice matters in conversations about justice and kindness. Subscribe to the channel if you believe stories like this should continue to be told. Stories that challenge prejudice. Stories that encourage responsibility. Stories that remind us to become better neighbors and better human beings. May God bless everyone watching today. May He guide our hearts toward wisdom, patience, and fairness. And if you believe that dignity is worth protecting and justice is worth fighting for, type Amen in the comments and stand for a world that listens before it condemns.